The recent protest in London saw thousands of farmers and their supporters gathering to demonstrate against Keir Starmer's government, primarily in opposition to new inheritance tax policies that they claim will severely impact family-run farms. Hundreds of tractors blocked key areas in Westminster, displaying banners such as "No Farmers, No Food" and "Save British Farming," while honking their horns in protest. The protest stemmed from Labour's plan to introduce a 20% inheritance tax on agricultural properties worth over £1 million, a significant change from the previous exemption for family farms. Farmers argue that this will force many of them to sell off land, machinery, or livestock just to cover the tax burden, threatening the future of generational farming in the UK. During the demonstration, speeches were made by farming representatives, including National Farmers Union, NFU, President Tom Bradshaw, who became emotional as he warned of the mental health crisis this policy could worsen among farmers. Many protesters, some of whom had driven tractors from as far as Exmoor in Kent, expressed fears that this could be the final blow to their industry. Keir Starmer, however, defended his government's stance, stating that the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected and accusing opposition parties of fearmongering over the issue. Nevertheless, farming groups have vowed to escalate their demonstrations, with some suggesting potential food shortages as a form of protest if the government does not reconsider its position. The protests against Keir Starmer's government continue to escalate, with farmers and supporters vowing to sustain their demonstrations until their concerns were addressed. The large-scale rally in Westminster saw hundreds of tractors blocking major roads, leading to traffic disruptions and drawing significant media attention. Key issues behind the protests. Inheritance tax changes. The proposed 20% tax on inherited farms over £1 million is at the core of the controversy. Farmers argue this policy would force many family-owned farms to sell land, livestock, or machinery to cover the tax bill, potentially destroying centuries-old businesses. Opposition from industry leaders. National Farmers Union, NFU, President Tom Bradshaw made an emotional speech about the mental health risks this financial burden could create, warning that some farmers might even take their own lives if their businesses collapse. Concerns over food security. Protesters highlighted that reduced farming viability could lead to food shortages and increased reliance on imports, potentially harming both farmers and consumers. Signs such as "No Farmers, No Food" and "Save British Farming" were prominently displayed, emphasizing the movement's warning about the consequences of these policies. Political reactions and government response. Keir Starmer defended the policy, arguing that it only affects large farms and that most British farmers would be unaffected. He also dismissed claims that the policy would lead to food shortages as exaggerations by opposition groups. Opposition politicians weigh in. The Liberal Democrats and Conservatives criticized the policy, with MP Jerome Mayhew arguing that losing a family farm is unlike losing any other business, as it's often the result of generations of hard work. Escalation plans. Future protests. Farming groups, including Save British Farming, have vowed to expand their demonstrations, targeting Labour ministers' constituencies with more tractor convoys. Potential food supply disruptions. Some protest organizers hinted at the possibility of strike action that could lead to supermarket shortages if the government refuses to negotiate. What's next? The protests have gained significant traction, with growing public and political pressure on the government to rethink the inheritance tax changes. If negotiations do not take place soon, it is likely that the movement will intensify in the coming months, possibly affecting the availability of British-grown food and causing further political strain on the Labour government. The protests in London against Keir Starmer's government continue to generate significant political and public discourse, with demonstrators pledging to maintain pressure on the Labour administration. As the movement grows, several key developments have emerged. Escalation of demonstrations. Following the major protest in Westminster, farming groups have announced plans to expand demonstrations to other major cities and target Labour strongholds where key ministers hold parliamentary seats. Protesters have warned of potential direct action measures, including blockades of food distribution centres, as a way to further pressure the government. Some farmers drove up to 8 hours from rural areas to participate, showcasing the deep frustration within the agricultural community. Public and political reaction. The Conservative opposition has seized on the issue, branding Starmer's policy as a tax on rural Britain and warning it could devastate local economies. The Liberal Democrats, traditionally strong in rural areas, have also criticized Labour's handling of the crisis, calling for urgent negotiations with farming representatives. Labour, however, insists that the tax change will impact only a small percentage of farms and has dismissed claims of an agricultural crisis as exaggerated fearmongering. Potential economic consequences. Impact on British agriculture. If farm sales increase due to the inheritance tax burden, there could be a shift toward corporate ownership of farmlands, potentially changing the traditional landscape of British farming. Food price increases. If protests escalate into disruptions of supply chains, consumers could face higher food prices or shortages of British-grown produce. Investor confidence. Economic analysts suggest that uncertainty over farming policies could discourage investment in the UK's agricultural sector, affecting long-term sustainability. What happens next? Further negotiations. Labour may come under increasing pressure to revise the inheritance tax policy, particularly if public support for the protests grows. More protests likely. Farming organisations have indicated they will not back down, and further large-scale demonstrations are expected in the coming weeks. Media scrutiny. As the protests continue, the media is closely covering both the government's response and growing opposition pressure on Starmer to rethink the policy. The ongoing protests against Keir Starmer's government are gaining momentum, with more sectors of British society weighing in on the issue. Here are the latest developments. Growing support for the protests. Broader public involvement. While the protests began with farmers opposing inheritance tax changes, other groups, including fishermen and small business owners, have joined the demonstrations, citing similar concerns about Labour's tax policies. Union reactions. Some agricultural unions and trade groups have started lobbying the government, warning that the policy could accelerate rural decline and force more British farmers out of business. Government's response. Starmer stands firm. Despite mounting pressure, Keir Starmer continues to defend the inheritance tax policy, arguing that it primarily affects wealthy landowners rather than ordinary farmers. Labour ministers on the defensive. Several Labour MPs in rural constituencies have expressed concern about the impact on their voters, potentially pressuring the government into policy adjustments. Escalation plans. More large-scale protests planned. Organisers have vowed to continue demonstrations across major cities, including Manchester, Birmingham, and Edinburgh, to highlight nationwide discontent. Potential supply chain disruptions. If farmers extend protests to blockades of food distribution centres, it could lead to short-term food shortages and rising supermarket prices. Political fallout. Impact on Labour's popularity. Political analysts predict that if Labour does not handle the crisis effectively, it could face a backlash in upcoming elections, especially in rural and suburban areas. Opposition gains ground. The Conservative Party and Liberal Democrats have ramped up their attacks on Labour, using the crisis to portray Starmer as being out of touch with rural communities. What comes next? The next few weeks will be crucial as Labour decides whether to modify the policy or stand firm against mounting opposition. If protests intensify, there is a possibility of economic disruptions and further political consequences. There are no credible reports of a large-scale protest in London specifically demanding Keir Starmer to step down. However, there have been multiple demonstrations related to various issues, including farmers protesting inheritance tax policies, cost-of-living concerns, and public sector strikes. If you're looking for a detailed breakdown of political protests in the UK, I can provide an analysis of recent demonstrations, their causes, and their potential impact on the Labour government. It appears that there is no verified news report about a mass protest in London specifically calling for Keir Starmer to step down. However, recent demonstrations have focused on various grievances, including farmers protesting inheritance tax. Many UK farmers gathered in London to oppose Labour's new tax proposals, which they argue could force family-owned farms to sell land or livestock. Cost-of-living protests, public frustration over inflation, rising energy costs, and economic challenges has sparked demonstrations in various parts of the UK. Public sector strikes. Workers in industries like healthcare, transport, and education have protested for better pay and working conditions, creating disruptions in major cities. If you're looking for further details about recent protests in London or political opposition to Keir Starmer, I can find relevant sources or provide an analysis of Labour's current challenges. Since there are no verified reports of a large-scale protest in London specifically demanding Keir Starmer to resign, I can provide insights into recent political demonstrations in the UK, their causes, and their potential impact on the Labour government. Recent protests in the UK. Farmers' protests. Farmers have demonstrated against inheritance tax changes introduced by Labour, fearing it could force the sale of family-owned farms. Protests have included tractor convoys in central London and calls for tax exemptions to protect small farms. Cost of living protests. Demonstrations have taken place over rising inflation, energy prices, and government economic policies. Protesters argue that Labour has not done enough to ease financial burdens on working-class families. Public sector strikes. Healthcare workers, transport staff, and educators have gone on strike demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Union leaders have accused the government of failing to address public sector pay disputes. There are no credible reports about a mass protest in London specifically demanding that Keir Starmer resign. However, recent demonstrations have taken place, particularly involving farmers protesting against inheritance tax changes proposed in the latest budget. Farmers across the UK, particularly those owning estates worth over £1 million, have been protesting against these tax changes. Hundreds of tractors blocked parts of central London, and a protest in Milton Keynes forced Prime Minister Starmer to abandon a planned visit. Protesters played loud music, honked tractor horns, and demanded the government address their concerns. Many farmers argue that the tax changes could force them to sell parts of their farms, impacting future generations. Starmer responded by stating that farmers have the right to express their views and that the government has provided financial support to the sector. There are still no credible reports confirming a mass protest in London specifically demanding that Keir Starmer resign. However, here are some key developments regarding recent demonstrations in the UK. Farmers' protests escalate. Farmers have intensified protests against Labour's inheritance tax changes, fearing they will lose family-owned farms due to new tax burdens. Tractor convoys and blockades have disrupted key areas, including Westminster and Milton Keynes, forcing Keir Starmer to cancel a scheduled housing project visit. Protesters argue that the policy will weaken British farming, increase food imports, and lead to higher supermarket prices. Broader political discontent. Public dissatisfaction with rising costs of living, taxation policies, and public sector wages has led to multiple demonstrations across the UK. Healthcare, education, and transport workers continue to demand higher wages through strikes and protests. Government response. Starmer has defended the inheritance tax policy, stating it only affects the wealthiest estates and that Labour remains committed to supporting UK farmers. Labour MPs from rural constituencies have expressed concerns about the protests, increasing pressure on Starmer to reconsider aspects of the tax plan. What's next? If the government does not negotiate with farming unions, protests may escalate into food supply disruptions and wider rural unrest. Political analysts suggest these protests could impact Labour's standing in rural constituencies ahead of the next general election. The recent protests in London were primarily led by British farmers opposing Prime Minister Keir Starmer's new tax policies, particularly changes to inheritance tax on farmland. Thousands of demonstrators, along with hundreds of tractors, descended upon Westminster, blocking roads and demanding a reversal of the tax changes. Farmers are protesting Labour's decision to introduce a 20% inheritance tax on farms worth more than £1 million, which they argue could force many family-run farms to sell off land to cover tax bills. Many protesters claim that the policy treats farmers like second-class citizens and risks destroying traditional farming businesses. Some protesters even displayed a Union Jack-draped coffin labelled "RIP Farming" to symbolize what they see as the death of British farming under Labour's policies. Despite the outcry, Starmer has stood firm, stating that the tax changes are necessary to balance the economy and prevent wealthy investors from exploiting farmland for tax avoidance. His government argues that most farmers will not be affected, but the National Farmers Union, NFU, has warned that over 60% of farms could face financial hardship due to the changes. The protests have gained political attention, with Reform UK figures such as Nigel Farage and Richard Tice backing the farmers, claiming the demonstrations reflect overwhelming rage against Labour. Some groups are now threatening further protests in Labour-held constituencies, and there is speculation that coordinated farm strikes could lead to food shortages in supermarkets. Thousands of farmers and protesters have gathered in London and other parts of the UK in response to Prime Minister Keir Starmer's controversial agricultural tax policies. The protests, which have lasted for several days, were largely sparked by Labour's plan to introduce a 20% inheritance tax on farms worth over £1 million, set to take effect in April 2026. Farmers argue that this policy will force many of them to sell off their land, potentially threatening the future of British agriculture and food security. In Westminster, protesters staged dramatic demonstrations, including a cortege procession featuring a Union Jack-draped coffin labelled RIP Farming. Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, shared footage of the event, claiming that farmers had taken over Westminster. Meanwhile, in Buckinghamshire, Starmer was forced to cut short a visit after farmers and tractors loudly protested outside, honking their horns and demanding a dialogue with the government. The National Farmers Union, NFU, has strongly criticised the inheritance tax policy, calling it a disastrous move that threatens family farms. NFU President Tom Bradshaw has urged the government to pause the policy, saying he has never seen such widespread anger and despair among British farmers. Some protesters have likened their movement to the large-scale farming protests seen in France, emphasizing that their frustration with the government is at an all-time high. In response, Starmer defended the tax changes, stating that his government had to make a choice between funding tax breaks for farmers or investing in reducing NHS waiting lists and improving the economy. However, farmers argue that the government has not adequately listened to their concerns, with some saying they feel like second-class citizens under Labour's policies. The recent protests by UK farmers against Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government have intensified, with thousands of demonstrators gathering in Westminster. The primary issue driving the protests is the government's decision to introduce a 20% inheritance tax on farms worth over £1 million, set to take effect in April 2026. Farmers argue that this will force many family-run farms to sell land to meet tax obligations, threatening their livelihoods and the UK's food security. The protests in London involving thousands of farmers and their supporters stem from frustration over recent government policies,